All right. Hi, and thank you to everybody who's joining us out there in the land of the internet, and also to everybody who's joining us here in their various little screens. So I know some of us are just sitting down at the end of the day at 5 p.m., and for some of us here in Melbourne and Sydney, it's 7 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, of course, to Verso Books for facilitating this and hosting, and thanks also to the Relational Poverty Network. Verso Books you've likely heard of. It's, of course, one of the oldest radical publishing houses in the world, and the Relational Poverty Network, if you haven't already run into them, they're an international network of both scholars and activists who are sort of challenging the kind of more traditional received notions of what quote unquote poverty might mean and how one organises in response to it. And finally, thanks to our speakers here, we're joined today by Sanford Schramm from CUNY, Karen Gustafson from UC Irvine, Lizzie O'Shea, who's an author for Verso, Eve Vincent from Macquarie University, and Thomas Goki from the Debt Collective. So we are about halfway through our 4-part teach-in series. We've had the first 2 last week and the week before, and then we're about to go into the 3rd, and the 4th one will be next week. So I wanted to say just a few things to orient us as we're halfway through. So the series overall has been motivated by Arundhati Roy's phrase, in some way motivated by Arundhati Roy's phrase that the pandemic is a portal. And the question then is, a portal to where? So if we can even see just a little bit further down the tunnel or around the corner, is there some way that we can organise, anticipate and organise and sort of marshal our efforts to steer the world in a slightly kinder way? I'm also motivated by Rebecca Solnit's insight that disasters begin suddenly, but never end. And so we saw, for example, a decade ago that global financial crisis and the so-called recovery that came after it were immediately reorganising capital and labour in ways that deepened the existing inequalities across the industrialised world. You know, billionaires by and large got richer during the crisis. New jobs were created that were often more precarious, and a decade later, most of us are even more in debt than we were beforehand. And maybe more importantly, the kind of neoliberal common sense of growing the economy, jobs and growth, further tightened its hold over our policy landscapes. So we have to ask, recovery for whom? So the disaster of that financial crisis very quickly became a new normal for many of us. So one of the things we're motivated by in this teaching series is to ask what sort of a new normal is congealing around us right now. So over the last 3 months, at least in the English-speaking world, as the pandemic has spread, and the places where the pandemic has been spreading in the last 3 months, we've already begun to see new alliances and ideological positions across our social, political and economic landscapes that congeal in ways we couldn't have anticipated before. And this is both terrifying and also maybe exciting. You know, who would have thought that all of a sudden it would become politically possible to shelter homeless people in hotel rooms by the thousands? It turns out we've always been able to afford this if we felt the crisis was pressing enough. You know, by the same token, who would have thought even 3 months ago that some of our leaders would openly call for our elderly and vulnerable to sacrifice their lives to protect the smooth functioning of capitalism, and to do it explicitly. For better and worse, we're in a new world, and our job in these sessions most broadly is to try to identify what has changed in that world and what possibilities are in front of us. So if the pandemic is a system-wide crisis, we also I want to ask us to think about what sort of crisis it is. And I've been reminded a lot in these sessions of Antonio Gramsci, who's another person who did his best work under lockdown, albeit in an Italian prison. And I'm reminded of the distinction he made between conjunctural and organic crises. A conjunctural crisis for Gramsci was a particular moment in which political and economic forces combine in unexpected ways and produce immediate effects. But those crises were often blips on longer structural transformations, which could last decades, in which the fundamental contradictions of a given political and economic system were worked out. And surely the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities and conflicts and profound contradictions in our own social structures. So I'm reminded of one doctor from New York who described the structural violence and systemic racism that so predictably exposed black and brown bodies to the coronavirus disproportionately compared to white bodies, as describing the pandemic as a crisis within a crisis. And so part of our job here is to ask what is the relationship between each of those crises? And surely the pandemic is innumerable crises within this one crisis. So, for example, after 40 years of free market reforms and the re-entrenchment of a neoliberal world order, where we were already seeing all of these contradictions play out and spin out of control before the pandemic began. So which of those are being reinvented now and mutating now? So we find ourselves in both a conjunctural and an organic crisis, comparable in magnitude to the period of the Great Depression. And if the past is prologue, the next decade could be a time of great authoritarianism and fascism, or the next decade could be a time of intensive organising for labour, solidarity, social programs that might get us towards something a bit more like the compromise of the Fordist era and the welfare state, or maybe even further. And maybe what we're calling now a Green New Deal might be something even more liberatory than that. Or potentially, paradoxically, it could be all of these things at once. So our job is in these 4 sessions is to try to look around the corner a little bit and identify what some of those mutations are that we're living through, what new normals are congealing, and where we can put the pressure. So all 4 of these teach-ins are motivated by the Relational Poverty Network's approach to both theory and practice, which is to trouble our assumptions about the word poverty. You know, the word poverty presents itself as a prosaic, seemingly common sense description of reality, which is a clear sign that we should be suspicious of it. What passes for common sense is usually a veiled ideology of some sort. And the ways in which poverty is discussed are commonly that. So what the Relational Poverty Network does instead of treating poverty like an object, a phenomenon, something to be regulated, controlled, and even disincentivized, is to ask what sorts of relationships are we talking about when we use the word poverty? The word poverty, in fact, indexes a series of intersecting complex relational structures. So we don't take relational poverty studies speaks not simply in terms of poverty as an object or phenomenon, but as the product of interlocking systems that produce relationships of power and vulnerability, privilege and deprivation, wealth and exploitation at exactly the same time, and do so across multiple domains, from corporate profiteering to gendered partner violence, from animal slaughter to the prison industrial complex. And I want to acknowledge that we're holding this meeting in the shadow of riots happening in Minneapolis right now, precisely as a result of layers upon layers of economic, racial and social and political disempowerment that produce the thing that then is called poverty. So each of our 4 sessions picks at a particular thread. We've had 2 already, dealing with shelter and then care and social labour. Today's deals with safety nets, but also the broader question of the economic imagination. And then the 4th will deal with borders, mobilities, and what they tell us about nations. So each of these different vectors is a way to sort of, like the proverbial blind man around the elephant, grasp something of the larger, messier set of transmutations we're living through at the moment. So for those of you who are joining us, who've joined multiple sessions, I hope you can begin to see common threads emerge across all of them. So in the first session, for example, we heard about the ways in which the notion of private property that seems like an inviolable part of our economies has suddenly been thrown open to renegotiation, as on the one hand mortgages are paused, evictions are temporarily banned, and on the other hand, as shelterless people take refuge in vacant houses in greater numbers than we've seen in a long time, squatting and challenging the basic inviolable notion of private property. In some ways, that feeds into our conversation today about what are our fundamental assumptions about what constitutes the economy and how can those be suddenly mutable in this moment. By the same token, last week we heard about the invention of this category of essential labour and how the invention of that category becomes a form of coercive power over the people who occupy it. Disproportionately feminised jobs and disproportionately black and brown bodies occupying those jobs are compelled to have to keep working, or else they don't have access, for example, in the United States, or else they don't have access to unemployment payments. And so there is a thread between this changing role of labour and the changing role of the safety net. So I hope if you're attending multiple of these sessions, you can start to see the common threads that are emerging, and somehow we can get a more complex picture of the elephant around which we're all organised right now, which is the pandemic and which is the crisis of capitalism in the early 21st century. So in this particular session, I'll let everybody else say a lot more about it than I will, but I just want to say that one of the things we've all been struck with is the way in which the pandemic reveals what every 6-year-old knows, that money is imaginary, that the economy is a construct, and that it can be renegotiated when it suits us. And so suddenly it's possible, we're inventing new metaphors left, right and centre. Suddenly it's possible for an economy to hibernate or snap back or close or open. And, you know, I think many of us regret that. So we've suddenly realised that, among other things, an economy is poetry. It's a turn of phrase. And many of us regret that it's politicians rather than poets who are inventing the new vocabulary for what is possible in an economy right now. So today we'll talk broadly about what is this thing that is the economy, how are we imagining it, and within that, what role is the safety net playing, both for better and for worse. So I won't say any more than that. We'll be hearing from our speakers in 3 blocks, 2 blocks of 2 speakers, and then 1 block of 1, after which we'll have a block of Q&A. So for our first block, we've got Sanford Schramm from CUNY and Karen Gustafson from UC Irvine. And if memory serves, Sanford was going to go first. So I'll hand it over to Sanford.
Right, David, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be involved in this panel and discussion. I think is very important. As I've indicated to folks previously on multiple occasions, it's been quite an experience for me to get recruited into the Relational Poverty Network and to rethink the issue of poverty in relational terms. And I think that that's a very succinct and concise but powerful way to talk about these issues, especially today in the age of the pandemic. I mean, one of the things that you highlighted is the power of discourse, which is a topic near and dear to my heart that I've written about a fair amount, and I think it is proving to be critical once again. But it's interesting how we see how the discourse very much is not that imaginative this time and is reinscribing a lot of the invidious distinctions, what I've previously have called the deep semiotic structure of deservingness that is so deeply embedded, especially in Western welfare states. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Well, now we have all kinds of problems going. Sorry about that. I got to hold my camera still, and I think I can do better this way. And I just got a phone call. But so deep semiotic structure of deservingness seems to never go away. And even here, we have this crisis where we have to think about things in unimaginable new terms. And still, we're thinking about it in terms of personal responsibility versus collective solidarity. Like all these white people that are showing up at capitals, protesting in the United States and different states, their frustration about lockdown policies and social distancing and wearing a mask. And they very much want to insist on their individual rights to be able to not have to promote what's best for us collectively, and that it's simply an issue of personal responsibility, which so shortchanges the issues at stake here, where you wear a mask not so much to protect yourself, but to not infect other people. Which is something that we could have known for years. Like a lot of people every year get a flu vaccine, and very often they think of it simply in terms to protect themselves from being infected by the virus, when in fact, many doctors will encourage people to get the vaccine for the good of others so that they don't spread the virus to other more vulnerable people. But in the United States in particular, where these notions of individual responsibility are so deeply embedded, that here we have this opportunity to think more in relational terms about collective well-being, about public health as an issue for the collective public, and instead people are emphasizing individual responsibility, and they're outraged that the government is making them do something that they personally don't think they need to do for their own individual personal well-being. And so we're at risk of really a missed opportunity here, where the United States will perhaps struggle through this pandemic with horrendous levels of fatalities, and not learn to think more collectively and solidaristically. And our social safety net, to what extent it is a net, is going to find to have more holes than perhaps we had already feared. And so I'm not really good at making predictions, and I do suspect we'll survive this and we'll get through it. Whether the United States will be changed in the way that we'll be able to handle this better, I don't know. And whether it will lead us to want to think more socially, relationally, in solidaristic terms, and be more supportive of a welfare state, whether we'll become more like countries like Denmark or most of Western Europe and provide a real safety net for people, I'm much more skeptical about that. I could go on, but maybe I'll just stop at that point.
Sanford, thank you. And you've left us with a little bit of a surplus of time, so perhaps you and Karen can chat about that after her lightning talk.
Sure.
Okay.
Right. Karen from UC Irvine.
Thanks. David, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to sharing ideas with the other folks on this panel, some of whom I've known for a while, but most of whom are new to me. So in the United States, members of the right began constructing poor people as an underclass and receipt of public benefits as a reviled action long ago. And the left joined that song in full throat in the 1980s and haven't stopped being part of that choir. But American resistance to direct relief to the poor goes farther back. The United States has a long history of begrudgingly providing direct benefits to anyone, and we are seeing that in the pandemic, even at a moment of universal vulnerability where simply having basics would be good for everyone. So I thought I'd say a little bit about the privatization of risk that's happened over the last several decades in the United States, because I think that is shaping where we are with the pandemic. And so, with neoliberalism, we're usually talking about the privatization of economic risk, but that has fallout in all sorts of other areas. And one of the things that's happened over the last 50 years is the thinning of the economic safety net in the United States, and it was never particularly strong or helpful to begin with. But what benefits have been available to people in need have always been meager, stingy, punitive, and have involved extensive surveillance. What this has done is stigmatized poverty, stigmatized poor people. It has made both the experience of poverty something frightening and poor people something frightening. And workers, rather than demanding state supports, are turning to credit. But there's a long history of that as well in the United States. And maybe I think this probably connects with things that Thomas will say. But it's often said that to be American is to be in debt. And a lot of government programs provide not direct relief to people, but instead relief in the form of loans, keeping people tethered to either the government or to a private entity. So nothing comes without strings. And there was also a movement dating back to the 1960s that had to do with the great democratization of credit, as if borrowing money is a political good. And so particularly in the 1990s, there was deregulation of the credit markets in the United States. Almost anyone could get credit cards. We saw the expansion of payday lenders. And rather than movements for greater government supports for those who have slipped into poverty, we saw a lot more people turning to systems of credit, not just formal systems of credit, but also informal systems of credit to float them through the hard times. And this again connects to Sanford's work on personal responsibility, right? It's not the government's job to look after people. People need to find ways to take care of themselves. But it also means that when people do run into trouble, they dig themselves into deep holes, right? So Americans don't tend to feel broke when they're out of money. They are broke when they are out of credit. And so my guess is people really won't start feeling the worst of this economic pain for another month or two. We have been in lockdown here in California, sheltering in place since mid-March. So April rent and mortgage payments were sometimes missed. May, payments were missed by many, and we're about to hit June. Now, in a lot of places around the country, there are eviction moratoriums, but that doesn't mean that people's debts aren't accruing. And we were already at a point before the pandemic where there was Americans had accumulated $14 trillion in consumer debt. And this is a house of cards that will eventually come crashing down. And we haven't thought about that. What will that mean? What will that mean for everyone, for borrower and lender, for all of the relationships? And I think we are starting to see some renegotiation of these relationships, right? There are places where landlords are forgiving a month's rent or 2 months' rent. I don't know how long that can go on, but at about 20% unemployment, it's going to be put to the test. And the eviction moratoriums were for public safety, right? We want people to be sheltered when there is a virus in the community. But can we maintain that commitment to universal shelter? We're seeing some of that get tested here in California. So I live about a half-hour's drive from Disneyland. Right now, Disneyland is closed, and all of the surrounding businesses, many of which are hotels, have no business. Southern California also has a huge unsheltered homeless population. And after years of pushing, advocates and activists pushing for simply creating housing with attached supportive services, we now see it happening. Now, this could have happened a couple years ago. There were significant hepatitis outbreaks coursing through homeless encampments in San Diego, in Orange County, and in Los Angeles. And at that moment, there was the potential for communities to say, it's important that people have housing, and the big problem here in California is access to clean water. That people don't have access to toilets and hand washing facilities, and it's creating a lot of public health problems for people who don't have housing. But it's only now when communities are seeing the public health risks for everyone that local communities are finally saying, we will make housing available. It wasn't that hard, happened pretty quickly, but the question remains about whether we can continue with that movement. It's hard to stay hopeful in a moment like this, right? The mobilizing that's going on in the United States isn't exactly a movement of collective solidarity. What we're seeing is fragmented efforts, angry protests with scapegoating going on. But there are some efforts that give me some hope. So, right, workers are uniting. Workers' unions are becoming visible and demanding that workers have adequate pay and safe working conditions, particularly in light of the pandemic. There are networks of mutual aid developing. So, and a lot of these efforts had started long before the pandemic. They're just getting more traction now. So students at a lot of universities are creating networks of mutual aid. In the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a very big network of mutual aid among people with disabilities. And it's not only things like buying food or picking up prescriptions, it's also caretaking for each other, right? Very basic needs that people have, and suddenly there are beautiful networks emerging around that. And, you know, I think this moment of universal vulnerability is also soon going to call into question that idea of personal responsibility. When people who've been in that precarious middle class, working class, and find themselves facing debts they cannot pay, deciding whether they are or are not deserving in the society. So I will leave it at that.
Karen, thank you so much. But we have a few minutes for both of you to sort of respond to each other, or if you have thoughts and questions for one another. Sanford, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, no, I think Karen raised some really important points. I think the whole issue of debt and the reliance on credit is a very, very important one, especially in terms of how there's been this punitive turn in social welfare policy over the last 30 some odd years in the United States, and to some lesser extent in other Western European countries that have been forced to follow the American model, such as it is. I mean, debt is an important way of disciplining the subordinate populations by making them have to take on debt and then shoulder it and be responsible for it, and have to take whatever work is available in order to pay it off, and so on. So debt as a way of disciplining the poor, I think, has really come on. And also the idea of the population taking on more debt is really a form of privatized Keynesianism. And rather than the government taking on more debt, which lately it has now, for a long time under austerity, it was the idea that the government wasn't supposed to take on debt. But really what was going on is we were encouraging ordinary citizens to take on more debt to float the economy. And so this is very precarious, not just for the individuals, but for the society as a whole. Taking a relational approach about debt, we can see that our reliance on private debt has made us collectively more vulnerable.
Yes. And I think that the reliance on debt will also prompt people to think about what personal responsibility really means. In 2005, the U.S. Congress passed some restrictions in the Bankruptcy Act that made it harder for people to file for bankruptcy. Now, it could be that there are so many people who just have nothing left that we will see a lot of personal bankruptcies in the coming months. We're already seeing that begin with businesses, right? Retailers are starting to file for bankruptcy left and right, and some forms of bankruptcy involve years of court monitoring on a daily basis, right? Detailed surveillance. But then there's also clean slate bankruptcy, right? Fresh start bankruptcy for individuals. And what happens if we suddenly just have millions of Americans file for bankruptcy and all of these debts disappear because they have no income, no opportunity to pay them off, and the courts, under the existing rules, have to say, okay, fresh start. It could happen. I mean, and I think we are also going to see it with states. So one of the things that's happened with the pandemic is the federal government has thrown up its arms and said, states, you're responsible. When New York, when the governor of New York said, we are running out of money, we need help from the federal government, Mitch McConnell, one of our senators, said maybe the state should file for bankruptcy, or maybe the city should file for bankruptcy, right? Bankruptcy doesn't do away with those relationships. There are still creditors who are dependent. There are still people who need to be paid, with states and localities, teachers, firefighters, right? You can't just say, okay, we're not paying anybody. So, and we have all of these outstanding bonds. So, I think the relationship between the citizen and the state, that is in a moment of change. The relationship between debtors and lenders, everything's new, and I can't tell where things are going.
Yeah, in some ways right now it's like a game of chicken. It seems like they're just trying to avoid being the first to take the step that's necessary. Although it looks like now they're starting to negotiate. They realize what you're saying, that it's getting real, and that it may well come to pass that the government's going to rewrite the rules and allow for debt forgiveness to some extent. I mean, this was one of the problems, I think, with the 2008, 2009 Great Recession bailout and stimulus and so on, how much Obama's attempt to get home mortgage relief failed, and that even the Democratic Party just didn't want to go there based on notions of personal responsibility. And maybe this time we're learning how this is a much more deeply embedded problem.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think Thomas from the Debt Collective will have a lot to say about how people might be mobilising in response to exactly that too. And I also just want to flag for listeners who haven't tuned into our previous sessions, some of those points about the evolving organisations for labour solidarity and the evolving organisations for mutual aid were things that we talked about at a bit more length in the second session too. So please do check those out. And I also want to say, if you're listening to this, we welcome your questions and comments, and we'll be watching for those on Verso's YouTube channel. So if you're watching at Verso's Facebook page, pop over to the YouTube channel if you want to pop any questions or comments down, and we'll collect all of those and answer those at the end. So I want to move on. Thanks, Karen and Sanford. And I think that'll resonate really well with what Eve and Lizzie are about to say. So I want to introduce Eve Vincent, who's an anthropologist from Macquarie University, and Lizzie O'Shea, who's a lawyer, writer, broadcaster, and founder of Digital Rights Watch. And I won't say much more than that. I'll let the two of you get onto it. So Eve, I believe you're first.
Thank you so much, David. It's a real honour to be part of this session. And I want to acknowledge that I'm in Western Sydney this morning. I'm on Darug country. So I am really conscious of coming at this from a very different setting. There are many parallels which I think will emerge, but I thought I'd give some context. For lots of different reasons, Australia has not been overwhelmed with a health crisis due to COVID-19. There are now less than 500 active cases, and there have been around 100 deaths in Australia. So this island nation's populace is not sick, but the metaphor of illness is very much being used in terms of the economy. We've got to get the economy out of ICU, said the Prime Minister Scott Morrison this week. And of course, recovery is a term frequently used in describing what lies ahead. So unemployment looks set to hit around 10% in coming months. Some commentators are talking about a she-cession. So two deep recessions of decades past involved the loss of male blue-collar jobs as part of a familiar global transition to a deindustrialized post-Ford service economy. But the jobs being lost at the moment are in feminized professions, accommodation and food services. But of course, as we discussed last week, workers in other feminized sectors healthcare and cleaning are most exposed to risk, and women are also absorbing disproportionate amounts of care labour at the moment in terms of homeschooling and the extra housework associated with more time at home. So social security is a federal responsibility in Australia, a highly targeted, a highly differentiated means and asset tested system of what are called income support payments, are developed here in the first decade of the 20th century. That's when a national pension scheme was introduced. And the emergence of this welfare state was in parallel with the emergence of a racially exclusionary citizenship regime. So some categories of non-white persons, especially Indigenous Australians, were explicitly excluded from the provisions of what some term a wage earners welfare state. And these exclusions were incrementally dismantled between the 1940s and mid-1960s. So after claiming for support through a federal agency called Centrelink, eligible applicants receive fortnightly allowances and are subject to various participation rate requirements. So workfare and training courses developed through for-profit providers. These participation regimes are highly surveilled, and non-compliance or alleged non-compliance is penalised through various sanction systems. When I say recipients are paid fortnightly allowances, there are exceptions. So income management was first introduced into Indigenous communities around a decade ago. So portions of their social security entitlements are sequestered. They're sequestered onto electronic cards, barred from operating when the recipient tries to buy alcohol, gambling products, and in some cases, cigarettes. So the colonial logic is stark. These are experimental populations, and there's a push to generalise these measures. So in response to COVID-19, the federal government introduced two short-term emergency measures. First, it doubled the rate of the unemployment benefit, which is colloquially known as the dole, and it doubled a number of other income support payments. So for some time now, growing agitation on the part of unemployed persons had drawn public attention and I think garnered significant support for a campaign to raise the rate. So the dole had stagnated for around 25 years. It's now well below the poverty line. And because of a highly financialised housing market, so there's a lot of housing debt in Australia, Australian cities are among the most expensive places in the world to live. So the dole was doubled in late March. This decision in some ways was a great vindication of the Raise the Rate campaign, but it was also an intervention in the unfolding crisis of capitalism in aid of capitalism. So by that I mean that this higher payment rate ensures that those receiving the dole can continue to spend and not just subsist. So this higher rate has seen cash flowing through the economy via online purchases and money still flowing into rent and mortgages. Dramatic images of queues snaking along street blocks outside Centrelink followed this announcement. And importantly, the participation requirements have also been temporarily waived. So the second short-term emergency measure is a massive wage subsidy scheme whereby the government pays employers to retain staff even if they're not working at present. That history of racial exclusion haunts this scheme. Various temporary visa category holders have been explicitly made ineligible. So this brings us to the present juncture. I think from here on in, the argument rests on the question of what normal was and why we can't go back to it. So on the one hand, anti-poverty activists, as well as very institutionalized forms of social advocacy, are amassing evidence of what that doubling of the rate enabled. So they're collecting, there's this real kind of pressure, I think, on poor people to narrativize their circumstances for the public. And they're collecting personal stories. Who has, people are saying, I've saved enough now for a rental bond. I plan to move out of my parents' garage, for example. People paying off long-standing debt, people being able to thrive, not just survive. So their argument is the old normal was grinding poverty. the indignity of fulfilling frequently absurd participation requirements within this punitive and highly conditional social security system. On the other hand, the federal government insists that both schemes will end after 5 or 6 months. They also say we can't go back to the old normal, but they say so for different reasons, because the Australian Labor Capital Compact favoured labour. So a new industrial relations regime is needed, which will, of course, further erode the protections that remain after decades of neoliberal restructuring. And very frighteningly, after living through this ferociously hot summer of fire, the federal government is also sort of hinting that it's the extractive resource industry that will be key to the return to economic good health, and a new environmental regulation regime is envisaged. So in terms of the larger cultural meaning of this mass and very mediatised entry of ordinary people into the ranks of the unemployed, so my hope would be that this would underline the point that unemployment is a structural phenomenon, that to become unemployed is a result of a conjunction of larger forces rather than an individual moral failing. So far, however, my perception is that there is a tendency, I think this very much relates to what Sanford was saying, this tendency to draw a distinction, an invidious distinction, to use your term, Sanford, between those who are already unemployed, as if they chose unemployment, and they were clearly willing to work, but can no longer work because of an external contingency. So one obvious way of thinking about this distinction is that it reconstitutes the Victorian distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor. I think there's a slight sort of something slightly different going on. A more salient cultural distinction here is between dole bludger and taxpayer. So I'm using here some work by historian Verity Archer. She argues that this distinction between dole bludger and taxpayer first arises in the 1970s. In the following decade, some of the key architects of the new American welfare state, such as Lawrence Mead, became very influential in Australian policy circles. And this new pejorative discourse about dole bludgers emerges in this time. So the origins of this term are very interesting. It's originally a 19th century word for a sex worker's pimp who profits but doesn't really work. So the pimp or bludger lives comfortably off the sex worker's labour. And the dole bludger or welfare recipient is cast as living comfortably off the hard work of the taxpayer, even in fact compelling the taxpayer to keep working in order to keep society going and provide for the indolent poor. So at this stage, those who lost their jobs because of the pandemic can stake a claim to the status of former taxpayer. They have accidentally ended up on the dole, but the dole has become something different in order to accommodate them. It pays better, and the layers of surveillance and compulsion have been removed. So come September, it will be hard for the federal government to maintain that this unemployment is chosen, this disrespect is deserved, but they are arguing that the imperative is to discipline the unemployed into any form of work so as to stimulate growth and recovery. So they seem to be willing to re-erode the rate and conditions of the dole. They will attempt that, but it will certainly be contested. Sorry, I think I went over time, David.
You're right on time, and that has given me a lot to chew on. So I'll hand it over to Lizzie, and then we can chat a bit afterwards.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and thanks, Eve, for providing that context. I think that's really helpful, and the arguments that you're making I think are very valid ones at this particular moment. So I'm not an academic. I'm a lawyer, practicing lawyer, and I'm also an author. So I've written a book for Verso about technology and social movements for change and how they relate to each other, which I guess gives me a perspective more as an advocate and an activist rather than an academic, I suppose. So I'm also the chair of a digital rights organisation here in Australia, which has been agitating around various technological questions questions associated with the crisis, among other things. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the general ideas that this moment presents in relation to poverty and welfare reform, or the welfare state, at a theoretical level, but also bring in some of the work that we've been doing as digital rights activists in that community, because I think it holds relevance to these kinds of questions. And the starting point that I came up with is that the left often talks about redistribution of wealth and the critical importance of that to changing society, that every billionaire is a policy failure. And I think if we are to make good on that claim, we do have a responsibility to think about what that might actually look like. And at present, I think it's fair to say that the only institution that's really capable of doing this is the welfare state, that the mass redistribution of wealth at levels required to be able to facilitate people living in basic forms of dignity, that's going to come through the state as an institution. And that has implications, I think, for how we think about the welfare state and the delivery of services, in part because of some of the topics that people have touched on in the course of this teaching, how it's a tool of discipline and how it's improving and potentially entrenching that quality and what we can do about it. And so I suppose it's clear that the welfare state is can be a form of oppression, can be practiced in ways that are oppressive. But I think it's also critical that we recognise that in this moment of crisis, as others have touched on, there's a potential transformation for the better. And we've seen various economies and governments experiment with all sorts of different approaches that just mere months ago would have been pretty much unimaginable. So universal cash payments, universal experiments with the universal basic income, vast provision of housing where it hadn't happened before, as Karen mentioned, universal free childcare in Australia through a privatised format, but nonetheless the provision of childcare without cost to everybody, without qualification, and the rapid rise of unemployment benefits that Eve touched upon then. And so this really does represent a destruction of the accepted wisdom in terms of what we can and can't afford, which I think is something that we need to hold on to. And the question is, how do we organise around doing that? How do we pass out the bad parts of the welfare state from the good and turn that into activist momentum, into a social movement that can be effective as we move through this crisis and into forms of recovery and potentially back into crisis again, to make sure that the good parts that have come with this change, the expansion of the Overton window in terms of what's possible in relation to poverty and welfare, are retained, but not at the expense of or not with the attenuating bad parts. And I think that, well, in my work, at least in the book that I've written, I talk a little bit about this, obviously pre-COVID, but I talk about some of the ways in which I think we might start to think about this, that we need to think about in terms of designing welfare policy or discussing these ideas on the left. I think there's a few things that we ought to keep in mind. And one is that we need to imagine redistributing automation and the benefits that come from automation, because crisis will give rise to an investment in automation and innovation, I think, at the expense often of human workers and often some of the most vulnerable, or certainly at the expense of their capacity to work in conditions of dignity. So I think welfare programs need to talk about minimising exploitative work. We need to also recognise the value of non-productive work, of work outside of the market, is what I mean with that term. I'm not using it in a value-laden way, but we need to think about work in the home and caring work that is very important, and how we can protect it and support it. And we also need to think about the provision of basic needs for all people, regardless of their qualification or their entitlements within the formal structure of the state. And those are the kinds of overarching themes that I think we ought to try and hold on to. And there's various proposals on the left that have been toying with these ideas and that have often sat at the margins of the political public debate about these questions, have been increasing in importance and popularity. And this is perhaps a moment, I suppose, to start thinking about where they sit in relation to the crisis and also the future going forward. And that's what I did in my book. I look at some of these proposals, things like a universal basic income, a universal jobs guarantee, and then the idea of universal basic services. And while I think they've all got, good parts to them. I think there's the potential in all of them to increase the capacity of the state to be a source of discipline, of poverty management rather than poverty alleviation, to decrease people's dignity and increase stigmatization as a result. And we need to think carefully about not being too dogmatic about these kinds of proposals, but to talk about how they might be empowering and argue for them in limited perhaps ways or in complement with other kinds of proposals. And to the extent that people want to discuss those kinds of ideas, I think we can do so in the course of the discussion. But I suppose really what I was getting at, or where I got to, was that these programs all have worthwhile aspects, but there's no silver bullet to solving, or singular solution, I suppose, to ameliorating poverty. And ultimately, we probably need a combination of all these programs. We need the freedom offered by basic income, the sustainability and transformation of work that's promised by the organisation of a job guarantee, and the protection of dignity that's offered by something like universal basic services. But when I say that, it's clear that obviously a lot of these programs, we talk about universality, and that's a good thing, I think, for the purposes of destigmatizing poverty, for making sure that there isn't this qualification between the deserving and undeserving poor, that universality has a really important role to play as an element of welfare policy design. But I must say there's also a problem that goes with that digital rights activists particularly, I think, have been attuned to for a long time, and I think we need to start talking about in other contexts, and that's that universal programs have a tendency to centralise power in the state. So if we are to support redistribution of income in ways that are destigmatising and that promote a form of dignity, to use a shorthand term, then we also need to think about the power consequences that come with that, and that the state therefore becomes the central arbiter by design of these processes, and on occasion private companies as well. And how can we make sure that those that power relation doesn't become entrenched in ways that are oppressive? And I think that for that reason, it's really important that people who are organising around welfare reform or poverty amelioration and the like need to organise around rights like privacy and other kinds of digital rights. And I mean that not in the narrow contractual sense of the term, but actually the much more expansive idea of privacy and other kinds of digital rights that are really about freedom and autonomy, and that's a really critical part of work that we need to do moving through this particular crisis. And I say that because prior to this crisis, there had been a strong move towards the digitisation of welfare services and the welfare state in various countries, and that's taken different formats, but often it's in the form of a digital identity that might be the centralised point at which you engage with the state, that has very serious implications for how you might be able to interact with others, access services, participate in public life, and the implications are quite profound there. And to the extent people want to talk about other examples that where this has arisen around the world, we can talk about it because they're quite diverse. But there is clearly a common theme of power in the hands of the state. And the Special Rapporteur covers this in all sorts of ways and talks about how this is a power relation that's shifting in the early 21st century. And the example that comes to mind in the context of this crisis is contact tracing apps. That there's a perfect solution there, I think, a perfect combination there between tech solutionism and mass surveillance under the cover of the protective nature of the state, the state is the provider of safety in the context of these crises. And I think it's an important example to talk about, in part because though there are clear tendencies and pushes around the world to implement forms of digital identity through the form of contact tracing apps, what we've actually seen in Australia is some pushing back on that quite successfully. And I'm really proud of the work of lots of people in these movements have done to resist that form of bargaining. And what I mean by that is, we are groomed for this all the time. We're given, in the digital world, we're given a proposal that if you want access to free services, you need to give away your data, you need to give away your autonomy in some ways, you have to expect that you'll be part of a curated platform. And that kind of, the practicing of that kind of relation is what's now happening with this kind of technology when implemented by the state as well. if you want to enjoy the protections offered by a strong state that's looking after your health and managing these policies appropriately, you need to download this particular app and use it to track where you've been, who you've been in contact with. And that's power then that goes to the state, who is the arbiter of that information. And in many ways, this is, I think, going to be implemented in other formats through digital identity programs after this crisis starts to ebb and we settle into a new normal. And I think we ought to talk about resisting that because it's clearly quite an oppressive way of arranging welfare services, but also setting up a dynamic whereby you're inclined to give away your freedoms and liberties and autonomy and a sense of privacy in the most expansive sense in order to receive the benefits of safety that might be offered by the state. And so to that end, I think when we talk about privacy, we shouldn't just be thinking about whistleblowers and journalists and those people who might be a particular thorn in the side of state power. We need to think about the mass of everyday people who might be accessing welfare services and the like, or engaging with the government in all sorts of ways, and understand them as having a collective sense of privacy that they ought to be entitled to, and that shouldn't be something that the state gets to breach without consequence in order to be able to provide services, particularly welfare services. And that's why I think it's important to talk about this, because it was a clear example in Australia where the government sought to introduce this app and potentially come with it essentially a place to host all sorts of other access points for the state. So, you know, there was a move at one point, at least behind closed doors within the government, to attach your driver's license, your healthcare benefits to a contact tracing app, and eventually implement that as a form of digital identity in Australia. That was unsuccessful, which I think is a good thing, in part because of the work that lots of activists have been doing to resist it. And I'm pleased that happened, but we can expect that's coming soon. So that's, I think, something we need to keep in mind when talking about how we approach welfare and welfare service delivery throughout the 21st century. The other one that just comes to mind, which I just quickly wanted to touch upon, just because it's a very current example, is that other rights that relate to technology or traditionally have been associated with digital technology activists are things like rights around algorithmic bias, around machine-assisted decision-making within government programs and the like, and whether they're discriminatory. There's the idea of data centralisation, that there might be data gaps in data used to train computer programs. There's a clear example of how these rights that often are talked about by digital rights activists actually come into play in welfare context. And the example I wanted to talk about just quickly was about Robodebt in Australia. So a program whereby the government sought to match tax records to payments provided by Centrelink, essentially our welfare service provider, and to look at that automated production of debts that they assumed existed based on a really basic form of matching between those two sets of data. And I raise it because it meant that, well, I should give some context, nearly 500,000 people received debt notices that were either incorrect or that were automatically generated, but had the potential often to be incorrect, but were almost impossible to challenge. And just yesterday, the government has agreed to waive nearly $750 million in debt that was owed by people pursuant to these notices after 3.5 years. And that only happened because people resisted and fought and organised around these questions. And so these ideas of algorithmic bias, problems with data sets, poor design in machine learning, and human decision makers associated with these kinds of decisions is actually really critical, I think, to moving into the 21st century when it comes to welfare, because these kinds of programs will continue to be implemented, and we need to have people who are prepared to take them on and fight them, and greater collaboration between activists for that purpose is one of the best ways that we can do it. So that's the emerging trend I see that I think will help us organise to avoid the worst excesses of welfare service delivery and try and preserve some of the best elements. And so I think I'm almost over time, but I just wanted to quickly say, I suppose, that I think this is a moment of opportunity. It's a critical time to be organising. We need to demand universality without, of course, flattening difference, without accommodating diversity, of course, but understand that destigmatisation is a critical tool, but be quite cautious and sanguine about the potential to centralise power in the state and find ways to organise around resisting it.
Lizzie, thank you. I feel like I've got a million different questions at the moment, which I'll save till the end. But we've got a few minutes for Eve and Lizzie to respond to each other.
Yeah, thanks, Lizzie. So there's sort of a few, there's lots to pick up on in there. So I wanted to talk a bit about universality, but also the emphasis on dignity in your talk. I thought it might be worth just quickly commenting on the kind of the way, just as a contrast with what Sanford is describing, the kind of context in the US, the way the Contact app was introduced to the Australian public. You see these really different discourses at work here, where it was almost like we were encouraged to download it because we should prioritize a collective sense of the population's health, safety and well-being, and we should deprioritize, de-emphasize any kind of selfish personal concerns, individual concerns we might have around privacy. And I saw this argument, among the left, people kind of saying, I'm going to download the app for the greater public collective good. And I'm not, it's almost an indulgence to be worried about one's own individual private, data and privacy right now. Except that what happened, I think, is that it was the federal government was shown up as sort of, like falsely bribing us because they said, if you download it, we'll set you free. It will open up society again. And actually, before the requisite amount of people had downloaded it, the restrictions began to be eased anyway. And then everyone was like, well, we don't need to download it in order to get this thing that we're craving, which is more freedom of movement and time outside the home. And it does seem to have stalled as a campaign and as a process. That's my perception. And certainly I feel like in my kind of own social world, people were weighing up this sense of, should I download this for the greater collective good? And then as they were weighing it up, actually all the restrictions began to ease, and people realised that perhaps this was not the great necessary public health measure that it had been cast as, and it sort of seems to have fallen off the agenda. But anyway, that's my perception of what happened in terms of public discourse with the contact tracing app. What I was interested in your talk, I guess, is I think there is a tension in the Australian policy space around an argument for more universality in terms of Indigenous policy making, because we've consistently seen when there's a call for more universality, generally what happens is that targeted racist measures become then generalised to other categories of poor people. So there is some wariness, I guess, around arguments about universality. There was for a long time in Australia a sort of, at the policy level, a kind of understanding that very remote Indigenous people were not in a position to get full-time jobs and did need income support. And also in some ways a kind of understanding that there are different conceptions of work in some of these places. But then there's a move towards universality, which actually is a move to also discipline and punish Indigenous people, and in fact, as it turns out, to greater excess, in the same way that other kind of income support recipients were being surveilled, disciplined, punished. So some of those, there is a tension there between kind of the acknowledgement of various particularities, which has been a positive thing in the past, and then the discourse about universalism ends up being, well, okay, sure, we won't treat these people exceptionally anymore, and then things become sort of worse for everyone. But I also was interested in the emphasis on dignity in your talk, which I think is really crucial. And this seems to be, it's not just the doubling of the unemployment benefit that's so significant at the moment, it's the waiving of the participation requirements that are so humiliating, often absurd, and this seems to be part of what we can kind of, a glimpse into a possible welfare system in which people are not asked to do these things that are humiliating.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's a couple of problems with universality in the sense that it not only potentially gives rise to mass forms of disciplining, and I've talked about it in a technical way, but of course there's other ways in which that happens. But of course, also I think there's particular services, particularly in Australia, that rightfully are quite different. So there's Aboriginal health services, for example, that need to remain Aboriginal health services, Aboriginal-led, and run and accessible for Aboriginal people, because there's a long history of health services in Australia facilitating the removal of children, today, not just as a historical problem, but something that's been, the stolen generation is largely considered a historical problem, but in fact child removal is still at alarming rates in Aboriginal communities, and health services were traditionally associated with the historical problem of the stolen generation. So there's rightfully a scepticism among many Aboriginal people about accessing white-run healthcare services. So of course there's those kinds of political problems. I mean, it also arises in relation to the elevation of the unemployment benefit. How do we make sure that rise isn't then just returned to be or put forward as being justified because those who are unemployed didn't want to be unemployed, and returning to a much lower rate? So there's something that precious that comes from many people experiencing the sharp ends of poverty that come with this crisis. There's something important there, because it allows us to make sure that in the political consciousness there's a claim that these problems aren't ones that people bring on themselves for being indolent and lazy, and that it can happen to lots of us, and you still have a right to be treated as a human with dignity, notwithstanding you're poor. But of course, that comes with a potential snapback and the reopening of the economy, and the idea that then we should implement more disciplinarian forms of welfare. And I think we absolutely need to start talking about that, because and talking about what we want from redistribution from the state. Because I suppose that's where I started, really, that I don't think it's enough to say that we think that rich people are one of the biggest problems in the world, without then understanding what we mean by that as to how we can change it. Like, what are we going to do if we do treat billionaires as a policy problem? How are we going to make sure that we don't then, in the redistribution of wealth, just continue to protect a system that prioritizes market values over human dignity and value? And it's a problem I don't think we really talk about enough, and it benefits from cross-disciplinary collaboration across through different social movements.
I think that's probably a really good, I won't use the word pivot because that's a neoliberal shibboleth, but that's probably a good moment to turn to Thomas, who's working on, with the Debt Collective, working on, in some ways, very parallel questions, but in different domains. How do we envision distribution more equitably? So anyway, I won't say too much because Thomas can say that for himself, but Thomas, tell us about yourself and the Debt Collective and what you think.
Thank you so much, David, and to Verso and the Relational Poverty Network for hosting this and putting it all together. The Relational Poverty Network is a beautiful name to think of poverty in terms of relationship, because debt, on a fundamental level, a debt is simply a relationship. It is a social bond. And those social bonds can often slip into bondage and exploitation, but they don't have to. Mutual aid is a different kind of social bond. There are some debts that should be paid. One of the things that the Debt Collective tries to do is have everybody just step back from our current system and ask ourselves and think together, who owes what to whom? Which debts do we owe because they're just? And which debts should we refuse because they're unjust? Maybe the debt that I owe you is that if you get sick or hurt, you should get health care. Maybe that is a debt that we're currently defaulting on that we should be paying. What kind of debt do we owe in the form of reparations for decades of exploitation and slavery? The United States is actually very good at debt resistance. We're just resisting all of the wrong debts. So to give a brief background of what the Debt Collective is, we're basically envisioning ourselves as a kind of union for debtors, modeled on a workers' union, but not in any way in competition with existing working unions, but in solidarity with and extending that logic to debt, especially in an age of financialization. When our basic theory of change is that individually, our debts make us powerless, isolated, atomized. But together, our debts are actually enormously powerful. And the way that we would resist any particular debt sort of depends on what kind of debt we're talking about and the systems around those debts. But what's absolutely fascinating to me and really sort of tickles that part of my brain that likes to think creatively is that when you study the mechanisms of how these debts are set up, they're very, very complicated machinery. And the people who design them never really design them to withstand coordinated action of refusal in different ways. These are actually very weak systems if we can get organized and all work together and all take an action together. So the Debt Collective grew out of Occupy Wall Street. We met in Occupy when we saw that debt was the tie that binds the 99% together. It's also the direct point of contact between our lives and the 1%. You know, we know that it's not going to work to just be polite and ask Wall Street and the government to do things better, and that they're just going to listen to us because we ask them. We need to find that point of contact where we're cooperating with them and organized non-cooperation. And every month when we pay our debt, that is the way we cooperate. So we did a few things. For several years, we raised a bunch of money and we went out on the secondary debt market and purchased people's personal medical bills, student debt, criminal justice debt, just like a debt collector or a debt buyer was. These investors purchase debts for pennies on the dollar and then turn around and try to collect face value. So we purchased this debt for about 4 cents on the dollar, and then we just abolished the debt outright. But we know we couldn't buy everybody's debt, so we moved more towards organized refusal of payments, starting with former for-profit students who attended predatory for-profit schools. In 2015, we organized the first student debt strike that we're aware of with former students at a school called Corinthian College Incorporated, which is traded on Wall Street, and the largest investor was Wells Fargo. The second largest investors was a teacher's pension. And what has worked for us is pairing a direct action with a legal mechanism. So we found this law called the Borrower Defense to Repayment that had never really been used before, but it basically says if your school broke the law, you should be able to get your debt discharged. So that debt strike led to over $1 billion worth of debt getting discharged. In February, before the pandemic launched, or before the pandemic happened, we launched a national student debt strike for all kinds of student debt in the US. not just for-profit students. And so you can still join that if you go to strike.debtcollective.org. And we're trying to be very sophisticated about how we're doing this. We're not encouraging people to commit financial suicide and default as an individual, which can be very dangerous. But even before the pandemic, over half of people who had student debt were not making any payments on their debt in one form or another, whether you're in forbearance or deferral or an income-driven repayment plan where your payment is $0. These are safe ways of resisting your debt. Then the pandemic happened, and it seems like everything has changed. Things are really, really, really bad. It's hard to wrap my head around the enormity of suffering that is going on. Speaking daily to our members who are worried about getting sick, who have taken their parents out of nursing homes because they're worried about their parents, who are becoming their full-time caregivers, who have lost their jobs, who can't pay their rent, who can't pay their utilities, who are putting their basic necessities on a credit card because our safety net is made of plastic. Before the pandemic, 42% of people who had revolving credit card debt had that debt for a basic necessity, like diapers, utilities, medical bills. A lot of credit card debt is just medical debt that has been transmuted into credit card debt. So at the same time that there's all this suffering, we're also seeing that all of the things that we have been told are impossible suddenly become possible. All of these people we told we had to keep in prison, it turns out that was never true. We can release them. We were told that, oh, you have to make your student debt payments. The system doesn't work if you don't make their payments. Suddenly, they put a 6-month moratorium on all most federal student debt. We've seen water shutoffs reversed. We've seen moratoriums on debt collections. Serious proposals for some version of debt jubilees are being made. So when we started in Occupy, we were told we were crazy, but this has always been the practical solution. These debts are just social bonds, and they can and should be renegotiated. The 1% always renegotiate their debts. How many times has Donald Trump declared bankruptcy to walk away from his debts? We're seeing, as everybody knows, rent strikes organically forming all across the country. In April, 1/3 of all renters didn't pay their rent. In May, 1/2 of all renters said they didn't think they'd be able to pay their rent. I do want to speak briefly about, we say that we're all in this together, which in some respects is true, but it's largely not true. This is falling unevenly. And I want to touch just briefly on the rebellion that's happening in Minneapolis. That George Floyd worked as a restaurant worker, and that restaurant was closed because of the pandemic. He paid his rent to his landlord, who was also his boss at the restaurant. He was murdered on the pretense that he couldn't pay at a deli. And he used either a bad check or a counterfeit bill. I don't even know if that's true. Nobody knows if it's true. He was murdered for that because people need food. And right now, millions of people can't pay for their food. We've seen 40 million people lose their jobs. 40 million people lose their healthcare in a pandemic. People who are afraid to go to the hospital because of the medical bill, people who are dying because they didn't go to the hospital, people who are getting sick and then winding up with massive bills of one kind or another. These debts are never going to be payable, and we need to be honest about that. And so I guess in some ways, I feel like in the last 9 or 10 years since the last financial crisis, for most working people, that crisis there never was any recovery. And a lot of very positive organizing has gone on. In some ways, I feel like we're much, much stronger than we were then. 10 years ago, most people in the United States would not have described themselves as a socialist. Now it's, basically if you're a decent person, you're calling yourself some version of a socialist. A lot of things have changed. But if I'm honest, it sure seems like in this latest round of bailouts, the 1% have even consolidated their power more. And it seems like we're starting from behind. We're losing the first few rounds in some important ways, but I do feel like the genie is out of the bottle in a lot of respects. Jubilees are not just possible, they are necessary. And to focus just on the student debt portion, when we've launched this national student debt strike, we are again pairing it with a legal mechanism. Congress might not have meant to do this, but they actually gave the Secretary of Education a power known as compromise and settlement to compromise, settle, or waive any federal student debt for any reason whatsoever. And they made it absolutely broad, which means that the next administration, if they need to stimulate the economy, and Mitch McConnell has promised to be the grim reaper of any leftist policy, one of the only ways that the next administration might be able to do that is to cancel all student debt, which the Secretary of Education can do with one signature. That's my time, but there are so many things that the other panelists said that were just so fascinating, and I'd love to unpack a little bit.
Thomas, thanks very much, and I really appreciate you ending on a sort of concrete thing to look forward to potentially. I just looking at how much time we have, I think maybe the best thing to do would be to open up the floor to each of you to see, and I've been seeing all of you nod along to one another vigorously at various points. So I have questions, but I think maybe I might open the floor to see if any of you have questions or responses to one another. There's so many different ways that your points have all intersected with one another. Or else I'd be happy to jump in with a question. I want to think back to something that Eve said about when the time comes, be it September or whenever, for the government to try to claw back what gains that we've made in terms of entitlements, that claim will be made in the name of the economy. That claim will be made in the name of promoting the economy. And Thomas, you're making me think in all sorts of ways about the ways in which we could mobilise, or our claims could be mobilised in defence of the economy, or the economy could be mobilised against our claims. And I was listening to an economist the other day who was also a Democrat, who was talking about the United States and talking about the danger that when the economy goes from really, really, really bad to just really bad in the time between now and the next presidential election, it'll be fodder for people for whom it's convenient to say that the economy is doing well, to claim that we're in a recovery. And as you pointed out, Thomas, the thing that was called a recovery after the 2008 global financial crisis didn't reach many of us. So I have a question for all of you, which is, what do you think the quote-unquote recovery is going to look like, and where can we mobilise, or where will we have to mobilise when we are told that we have to go back to work, when we are told that the economy is on the upswing, when we are told that now's the time to make the choice between helping the economy recover versus helping coronavirus patients recover? It's a broad question, but yeah, what do you see the recovery looking like, and what's our terrain of struggle on it? Big
Can
question. Yeah,
can
please do.
I jump in? Well, I mean, I think in Australia, so I think there's a very valid fear that there will be a kind of extractive resource industry led sort of vision for recovery. But I think one way to kind of conceptualize arguing against that is to point to a period of time in which what it takes to care about other people and potentially the planet as well became so much more thought about and visible to us, and became much more kind of acknowledged as hard work. So there's been much more, I guess, a public discourse around, geez, it's really hard work to look after your children because they've all been at home and it's been hard. And so everyday constant care work has become much more visible to, us all as work. And so I think, one kind of hope would be that we were able to expand the way we imagine what work is to encompass all these kinds of very socially valuable forms of activity that are so not valued within, say, the participation requirement system within the welfare state. So I've interviewed people who are taking part in punitive and conditional programs who have very serious caring responsibilities, who say to their case manager, oh, I participate, I contribute to society. I catch 2 buses across a busy city to visit my mother who's elderly and lives alone, and I go every day. Could that be my participation requirement? And the caseworker looks at the list and says, no, not valid, right? And so I would like to imagine a society in which we reimagine what work is, what contributing to society is, and that somehow this period of time in which what it takes to care and the possibilities for care kind of help us do that reimagining, and that it could also be about, that we've reimagined dependency, vulnerability, interdependency, and that would also bring in the question of the planet.
Eve, that's really helpful, and also links us back to some of the conversations from last week about the sort of changing role of caring labour and social reproduction under the pandemic. Karen.
So one of the things I already see happening in the United States is this fragmenting of services around caretaking, right? So there are collective efforts to provide care to those workers who've been deemed essential, right? Some public school districts that have never provided care to preschoolers are opening up to provide care only to those essential workers. And there are now advertisements circulating for teachers who are afraid to go back to the classrooms when they open to simply become private teachers for wealthy families, right? So it's right, everything is stratified. And so, I'd like to think we'll figure out a way of honoring caretaking and making sure it becomes universal, but that's not what I see happening. I also thought I'd offer an idea on mobilizing as we are moving in and new policies are taking effect. So federal agencies in the United States calculate the number of predicted deaths that certain policy approaches will take. They don't get listed as part of the legislation, but they are calculated into the costs and benefits. And what they do is they simply give a number to each dead person and then figure that into the calculations. I think we should just start tallying the expendables, right? And how those calculations of premature death affect different groups, and they should be part of every policy that's put forth. We hold lawmakers, policymakers accountable for their death count, and we use those predictions of premature death in making policy decisions, right? Thomas asked, how do we value people over the economy? That's a straightforward way to do it.
Oh, well, I was just going to raise one thing, like perhaps Thomas might want to speak on this, but one of the things that I remember from reading an account of a woman who worked in a hotel as a cleaner when Trump was elected was that she preferred Trump over Clinton because Clinton sounded like her boss, but also Trump had bounced back from bankruptcy, for example. So it was something that she could identify with essentially as someone who came good after a critical crisis, which I think, of course, disguises what actually happened. But, you know, thinking through this, the way that debt features in the American psyche, I do have a feeling that as we move into the recovery, a lot of large corporations, much like they did in the 2008 crisis, will seek to consolidate their debts, ask for a bailout, and taking up that idea that yes, as Karen just pointed out on the chat, that he actually had 6 kids into bankruptcy, which is true. So, but well, I'm sure it's true. Sorry, I haven't actually checked. I believe you, Karen, absolutely. But what I was going to say was this idea that the 1% or the elite get to always renegotiate that debt, and that they never have to come good on it, and that essentially the losses are socialized and the gains are privatized, that that capitalism is this example of where you get to make profits all the time, but then when you're in trouble, you get to seek a bailout. How do we make sure that, firstly, that's not permitted, but also that the poor are given that privilege of being able to renegotiate that debt, or to be able to rely on the social safety net or a bailout when it's needed? And, do we, if we start to talk about it in those terms, do we start to fall into a trap of campaigning on their terrain? And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Thomas. How you negotiate that particular kind of way of thinking in that public discourse. Because the other thing I would add into the mix is we often talk about the economy as though it's like a household economy. That's often what mainstream journalism, how it describes, for example, the massive spending that's currently going on to keep people afloat in this crisis, and that eventually we're going to have to deal with that debt. And I'm curious to know if you think that there's a way of talking about that that allows everyday people to essentially get a bailout rather than just the 1%.
Yeah, so many good questions there. I mean, one thing to point out is one of Trump's bankruptcies was running a casino, where literally it's rigged so that the house always wins. And he was such a poor businessman that he didn't just lose money, he went bankrupt running a casino. I mean, you could put a half-eaten sandwich in charge of a casino and it would make money. But we have a different set of bankruptcy laws for corporations than we do for individuals. It's just night and day. And Joe Biden is actually largely responsible for rewriting bankruptcy laws for individuals to make it a lot harder. So even if you declare bankruptcy, you are often still stuck with your debt as an individual. So that's part of it. Part of renegotiating that is just legislative change and policy change. But the other thing is that we talk sometimes about the need for a jubilee. Historically speaking, jubilees have been conservative measures. They've been relief valves on society to keep the status quo running smoothly. During the Arab Spring, the Saudi Arabian government was very, very savvy, looking at the way that debt was leading to some of these revolutions, and they sort of got ahead of the curve and wiped out a lot of personal debt, which, from just like a short-term material conditions standpoint, was a huge relief for a lot of people. but they did it to keep the status quo in check. And bankruptcy is just like a small-scale legalized Jubilee system. And we have been removing so many release valves from our society that it's going to break. I don't know how it's going to break, but I see some of the rebellions that are taking place around the country, and it seems to me like if we don't take a massive debt cancellation and renegotiation, it's going to come out sideways in unpredictable ways, but in ways that force that rewriting of the terms. Part of that could be very positive. Part of that could be, some fascist rises to power. So it's not really something I want to bank on, but it seems like we should be changing our bankruptcy laws. We should be canceling a lot of debt. It's not necessary to force an explosion before we have a reckoning.
I wonder if I can jump in. I've got a few questions from the comment thread, and I'm mindful that some of us are going to have to go fairly soon. So I might take a few comments from or questions from the comment thread and collapse them together if that's all right with everybody. I have one question. One person asked, why are we bound solely by ideas of welfare when the economic imagination is evoked? How does the implicit historicisation set a trajectory for the future, and are we ultimately trapped in cycles of repetition? So, and that sort of comes back to, I think, partly the point that Lizzie was making, is that at the moment the vision that the left has is often quite bound by the history of the welfare state. So how do the visions of redistribution that we've had in the past, how does that set a trajectory for us in the future? How does that sort of determine our thinking? And then maybe this can build on that previous question. Another question is about how does the collapsing of home and work, public and private, through the pandemic open up new possibilities for an economic imagination? And along with that, what do we even mean by public and private today if those things feel like they're becoming collapsed? So I hope you don't mind if I throw those 2.5 questions at all of you at once. But I would love to hear what you think about either of those. So what about how does our historicisation, our kind of rootedness in previous models like the welfare state, influence how we think about welfare and the economy going forward? And 2, what is the implication of the sort of collapsing of home and work, the collapsing of public and private?
Yeah, I think that's a really profound question, actually. I mean, it raises these issues of what is the trajectory of history. Something that in the past I've tried to play with, the idea that history is not linear and it's not progressive and developmental. Things aren't necessarily always going to get better, but the history is more cyclical, that there is a tendency to counteract the prior movement. And we're living through a very regressive period where we've turned away from the welfare state. And so one way to look at this is that as we move forward, it's not like there's no simply going back to the liberal, democratic, solidaristic, inclusive welfare state. Neoliberalism is not something we can simply push aside. It's something that we're going to have to work through. And there are deep path dependencies that have developed where people are really, even at this critical juncture in a time of crisis, are going to want to carry forward. There are elements of the personal responsibility ethos that are so deeply now embedded in the consciousness of the quote-unquote deplorables, as they recently seem to want to own that label, that they're too into it. And so we have to begin to talk about alternative understandings of what does it mean to be personally responsible, or to be free, or to practice individual liberty. And I think Corey Robin and Alex Gorovich have a new essay about how the left needs to develop its own understanding of freedom, which is another way of talking about, like, it's not so much, again, as people have been pointing out quite eloquently in our discussion, buying into the prevailing frame or discourse, but recognizing it's not something that can be simply wished away.
That reminds me of Karen's point too, that we've seen a lot of people who are ostensibly identify with the left putting their energies into mutual aid networks rather than petitioning the state at moments like this.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's widespread distrust of the state on the left and the right that we are seeing in the protest movements on both sides at the moment. And there's particular distrust over government benefit programs. I tried to find a video clip and share it before this gathering, but I caught an interview with one of the Open Up protesters. So mainly white, often gun-toting, non-mask wearing protesters insisting that the economy must open up. And one of the protesters interviewed said, "I'd rather die than turn to the government for benefits." But you have to understand that in the United States, government benefits are also deeply racialized, deeply gendered. I mean, the correlate to the Dole Bladger in the United States is a welfare queen, right? Seen as a lazy Black woman with a lot of children, and it carries a lot of political weight. And she reappears every election year. And I don't know what it would take for her to disappear, right? She's so useful in mobilizing animosity towards government programs and towards the poor.
I wonder if I could also repose the, oh no, sorry, Eve, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought I would reflect on the sort of home-work boundary kind of collapsing. I mean, in terms of Karen's point about stratification, which is intensifying in the current moment, that's a very kind of stratified experience where higher income earners have been more likely to be able to stay home and work from home. So there is that degree of privilege associated with even being at home. But having said that, I think it's important to kind of interrogate that experience and what it's meant. I mean, I think one of the things it's meant is, I guess, the things that don't happen or that those people working at home kind of miss out on are social and collective experiences of society. So, you know, all those kind of micro interactions that make up the day, like you walk to the train station, you see your neighbors on the way past, you see, you know, the guys at the Korean grocery store and pick up some milk, then you see the train guards, then you negotiate a seat on the train. All these experiences of everyday social life and of society don't take place when you just remain at home, just work, and work becomes an even more invasive and bigger part of your life. So, I mean, I guess I have a fear of, I mean, I think the university could easily say, you know what, stay at home and teach online, and we know that you will just spend all your time working for us and miss out on it as some kind of experience of collective life.
Yeah, I just wanted to back that up, Eve, because, you know, there was a writer here in Australia who was talking about this issue about making the comparison from piecework at home in the 19th century, the move into factories and what came with that. And of course, what came with it was immiseration for many people working, but it also created the potential for collective what is when you're in your home. And I'm a union delegate, and I witnessed firsthand exactly how that happens. I mean, we're a strongly unionized workforce at my law firm, but the problems that you encounter as a worker around whether you're required to take leave, how you can work, organize your day, how you accommodate caring responsibilities that you didn't have before, it's all done as an individual, direct to your manager. And you don't even get to, you have to facilitate and work harder to talk to your delegates and plan a collective response. And the one-to-many nature as well of centralized communication of management to individuals, and that happens in not just communication, I should say, but also supervision of your work is, I think, has an immense potential to break down some of the collective nature of working that can give rise to radicalism. And while I appreciate that most organised workplaces, they're the minority rather than the rule, in most modern Western economies, I do think that they can lead on issues of elevating, or that a rising tide will lift all boats. And that's a problem that we might see if that doesn't occur. If unionised workplaces aren't able to agitate on the front edge of what's possible for working people, that will affect us all. And so I am quite worried about that. And I feel like we've got to work harder than ever to make sure that that kind of organising and collective activity in a political sense is also reproduced however possible in a working from home environment.
That reminds me of a comment from last week's session too about mutual aid organising networks under the pandemic are organising via Zoom, and so that's bringing different people together and enabling people who would not usually get along well if they were organising in person, crusty punks and social workers, for example. I also, I'm paying attention to the time, and on the note of collapsing home and work, I'm aware that many of you have care responsibilities to attend to, and this is important. So I wonder if I could perhaps call this to a close. I don't know if anybody has a parting message before we go, or I could just say thank you. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to all of you, and I'm deeply grateful that we can come together in this way. If there's, I won't use the phrase silver lining, because that's another neoliberal shibboleth, I think, these days. But what I am grateful for in the midst of all of this is that we are deliberately organising and coming together across global distances and social distances. So thank you for that. And again, if you're listening, I know there's one more question we didn't get to. I have to apologise. If you're listening, these will be archived on the Verso YouTube channel, so please share them around. I'm hoping that these make good teaching tools and organising tools for us going forward. And don't forget about next week's last of the 4 teachings, which is on borders, immobilities, im/mobilities, and pandemic nations, talking all about all the relationships between labour, international labour mobility, xenophobia, building walls, shutting down ports, and all the racism that goes along with that. So I'll let you all go. Thank you again. This is one of the things that gets me through the day.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed participating with everyone.
Yeah. Great
Thank
meeting
you.
all.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have met all of you, even virtually.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.